Morning they let me go. I'd already been at my desk for 2 hours. That was the thing nobody knew. I was always first in. 29 years of being first in. The parking lot security camera would have footage of my truck pulling into space 14B every morning between 6:47 and 7:02, depending on traffic on Route 9. I used to joke with the overnight cleaning crew, Darnell and his partner whose name I could never pronounce right, that I was their unofficial sign-off. When I showed up, they knew their shift was done. That Tuesday in March, I was working through a compliance discrepancy in the vendor ledger. Nothing dramatic. Just a number that didn't sit right. A $340,000 payment to a consulting firm I'd never heard of, coded under operational advisory, which was a category I'd personally created 15 years earlier for something else entirely. I had a yellow legal pad next to my keyboard, the same brand I'd used since my first week, and I was writing down account numbers the way my old mentor had taught me. On paper first. Always on paper first. My phone buzzed. A calendar invite, sent at 7:23 a.m. for a meeting at 9:00. The subject line said, Organizational Update, Accounting Division. I stared at it for a moment. Then I accepted it and went back to the vendor ledger. I need to back up. My name's not important for this story. What matters is that I was the controller at Dalton & Ferris Manufacturing for 29 years. I started when I was 26 years old, a few months after my wife and I got married, when she was still working double shifts at the hospital and we were splitting a 2-bedroom apartment with her younger sister. I came in as a junior staff accountant. I left. Well, you'll hear how I left. Dalton & Ferris made precision components, aerospace, defense, medical equipment. If you've ever been on a commercial flight built after 2003, there's a reasonable chance something in that fuselage was machined in our facility in Allentown. We weren't a glamorous company. We didn't have a PR department or a corporate campus with a volleyball court. We had 2 buildings, 412 employees at our peak, and a reputation in the industry for zero defect delivery. That reputation was the thing I was most proud of, even though it had nothing to do with accounting. The original owner, the man who hired me, was the kind of person who remembered your kids' names and asked follow-up questions. He built the company from a machine shop he ran out of his garage in 1974. By the time I joined, it was doing $40 million in annual revenue, and he was in his late 50s, walking the floor every morning in the same steel-toed boots he'd been wearing for years. He trusted numbers the way machinists trust calipers, not because he liked them, but because they told the truth when people wouldn't. He made me controller when I was 34. I remember the conversation because it happened in the parking lot of all places. He'd caught me staying late, again. And he walked me to my car and said, "You see things other people don't bother to see. That's the job." 3 weeks later, the offer letter was on my desk. His son joined the company when he was 28. I won't say much about him except this. He had an MBA from a school I'd never heard of, an opinion about everything, and a particular discomfort around anyone who'd been in the building longer than he had. He called himself a strategic operator, which I had to look up once just to make sure I understood what it meant. I still don't think I do. His daughter-in-law, his wife, came aboard 2 years after him. She had a background in marketing and a very clean desk. When the original owner had his first cardiac event, in the fall of the year before all of this happened, his son took over day-to-day operations. Within 6 weeks, he'd hired a consulting firm to do an organizational efficiency review. I'd been through 3 of those in my career. I knew what they meant. The 9 a.m. meeting was in Conference Room B, which was the smaller one, the one without windows. There were 8 of us from the accounting division. The HR director was there, a woman who joined the previous spring and whose name I still associated with the LinkedIn connection request she'd sent me my second week. The son was standing at the head of the table. His wife was seated to his left with a laptop open. There was a printed document face down at each seat. He talked for about 4 minutes. I remember thinking his sentences were very long, the way people's sentences get when they're nervous and trying to fill space. Something about evolving the company's financial infrastructure. Something about a landing headcount with our next phase. Something about an incredibly difficult decision. Then he turned the document over. My name was not on the list of people being retained. I want to be precise about this. Because the precision matters, I was not the only one let go. There were 3 of us. But I was the only one whose replacement was sitting in the room. She'd been brought in 2 weeks earlier, introduced to me as a consultant who'd be helping with the ERP transition. I had trained her on our vendor coding system. I had shown her where we kept the physical backup files. I had answered every question she asked with the assumption that she was there to assist me. She was 27 years old. She had very good posture. She did not look at me when they turned the document over. He said a few more things. The HR director said a few more things. They told us we'd receive severance information by end of day and that we were welcome to gather our personal belongings with an escort. An escort. 29 years, and they sent someone to walk me to my desk. My wife knew before I got home. Not because anyone called her, because she knows me in the way that only comes from 31 years of paying attention, and when I texted her at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday to say I was on my way home, she understood what that meant without me having to say it. She was standing in the kitchen when I came in. She didn't say anything right away. She just poured me a cup of coffee and sat down across from me at the table where our son used to do his homework. Our son was finishing his 2nd year of college at the time. Engineering. He called me that night, and I could tell he'd been coached by his mother on what to say, which made me love both of them more than I knew how to express. He said, "Dad, you're the best accountant I've ever met." Which was funny, because I'm the only accountant he's ever met, and he couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life. He got that from me, actually. I'm terrible with my own money. I'm only good with other people's money. The first 2 months were strange in the way that grief is strange when you don't have the vocabulary for it. Nobody tells you that losing a job you've had for nearly 3 decades feels a little like losing a person. Not because you loved it. I'm not sure loved is the right word for what I felt about accounts payable, but because it was the structure around which everything else was organized. I woke up at 6:15 every morning for 6 weeks before I stopped setting my alarm. I took a few calls from recruiters, attended 2 interviews. Felt, each time, like an artifact from a different era. My wife, who has more practical intelligence than anyone I've ever met, told me to stop feeling sorry for myself and start consulting. I had 29 years of experience in precision manufacturing finance. I knew GAAP compliance, government contract accounting, defense supplier audits. She said, "You know things people need to know." I said, "I'm 54. She said, "What does that have to do with anything?" She was right. She usually is. I registered an LLC, printed 50 business cards, and felt mildly ridiculous. But I made 3 calls to people in my network, and by the end of the 2nd month, I had 2 small engagements. Neither of them paid what I'd been making at Dalton and Ferris. Together they paid about 60% of it. We adjusted. 8 months after they walked me out, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I'd been getting calls from recruiters at odd hours, and I was tired of the scripts they use, the way they said exciting opportunity about everything regardless of whether it was. But I answered it. The man on the other end introduced himself as the CFO of a private equity group called Vantage Industrial Partners. I knew the name. They'd acquired 2 regional manufacturers in the past few years, both in sectors adjacent to what Dalton and Ferris did. He said they were in the final stages of evaluating an acquisition and that my name had come up in their due diligence process as someone with deep institutional knowledge of the target company. The target company was Dalton and Ferris. I sat down. He said they'd been doing background interviews with former employees and former vendors, which was standard practice for their acquisitions. He said my name had appeared in documentation they'd reviewed, specifically compliance reports and audit trails going back over a decade. He said they had some questions about certain accounting treatments they'd encountered in their review, and they wanted to speak with someone who understood the historical context. I said I'd be glad to speak with him. We met 3 days later at a hotel conference room about 40 minutes from my house. I brought my laptop and a banker's box of personal files I'd kept, copies of reports I'd authored, documentation of decisions I'd flagged through proper channels, a folder of emails going back 7 years in which I'd raised concerns about specific vendor relationships and received in response instructions to process the payments as submitted. That folder was the one I was most careful about. I kept it not out of strategy or foresight, but out of professional habit. When you work in finance long enough, you learn to document the times you said something, not because you expect anything to come of it, because you need to be able to sleep at night knowing the record exists somewhere, even if no one ever looks at it. He looked at it. He and his team spent 4 hours with me. A woman from their legal department joined by phone partway through. They asked careful questions, the kind that told me they already knew the answers and were checking to see if mine matched. I answered every question I was asked. I showed them the documentation I had. I did not editorialize and I did not speculate. I told them what I knew and how I knew it. At the end, he said, "Can I ask you something off the record?" I said he could. He said, "Did you know when you were still there that this was the direction things were heading?" I thought about the $340,000 payment. The consulting firm I'd never heard of, the yellow legal pad with the account numbers written in my handwriting. I said, "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know how wrong." He nodded slowly. He said, "That's usually how it goes." The acquisition announcement came 2 months later, and it was not the announcement anyone at Dalton and Ferris had been expecting. Vantage Industrial Partners announced they were withdrawing from the acquisition process, citing material discrepancies identified during financial due diligence that could not be resolved to the satisfaction of the acquiring party. The language was careful. It always is. What followed the announcement was not careful at all. The State Attorney General's office opened an inquiry. A regional business journal ran a story about the withdrawn deal that was, I thought, fairly measured, though several people I knew called me after it published to say they'd always had a feeling something wasn't right. I did not say anything to any of them except that I hoped things would work out. Dalton and Ferris's primary lender put the company's credit line under review. 3 of their largest defense contracts were suspended pending resolution of the inquiry. The Sun, who had been running the company for less than 18 months, hired a crisis communications firm and gave an interview to the Journal in which he used the phrase, "We are cooperating fully," 4 times in 6 paragraphs. His wife, I heard through someone I'd stayed in touch with, had quietly returned to the marketing firm she'd worked at before. I heard these things the way you hear news from a place you used to live, with a complicated kind of attention that isn't quite caring and isn't quite indifference. I had spent 29 years keeping those books clean. I had raised concerns through proper channels in writing, which I could prove, and been told to process the payments as submitted, which I could also prove. I had done my job honestly and then been replaced by someone 27 years old, whose main qualification, as far as I could determine, was her willingness not to ask the questions I was still asking. None of that felt like victory. It just felt like the truth finally finding the light it had been owed for a while. Vantage Industrial Partners called me again 6 weeks after the withdrawal announcement. They were restructuring their acquisition strategy. They'd identified 3 companies in the region as potential targets. Smaller operations, cleaner books, better positioned for what they were trying to build. They needed someone who understood precision manufacturing finance at a granular level, who knew the regional supplier network, who could sit in on their due diligence teams and translate what they were seeing into language their investment committee could actually use. They offered me a consulting contract. I took it home and read it twice, which is more than I've read most documents in my life. And I'm a man who reads documents for a living. I called my attorney, my brother-in-law, who does mostly real estate but who has good instincts, and he read it and said the rate was fair and the terms were reasonable. My wife read it and said, "Take it." I signed it on a Thursday afternoon at the kitchen table. My son called that night. I texted him the news, and he said, "Dad, see, you just had to wait." Which is the kind of thing you say when you're 20 years old and time still feels infinite. I didn't correct him. I just said, "Yeah, buddy, you're probably right." There's something I want to say about the year between the Tuesday they walked me out and the Thursday I signed that contract, because I think people who haven't been through something like this don't fully understand what that year does to you. It's not just the money, though the money is real and the stress of it is real, and anyone who tells you money isn't the point has either never had to worry about it or has conveniently forgotten what that worry feels like. Our son's tuition was real. Our mortgage was real. The conversation my wife and I had in February about whether to refinance was one of the hardest conversations we've had in 31 years of marriage, and we've had some hard ones, but it's also something else. It's the loss of a story you've been telling about yourself for decades. I was the controller at Dalton and Ferris. That was a sentence that meant something to me, that fit inside my understanding of who I was. When it was gone, I had to figure out what the sentence was now. And that process is slower and stranger and more disorienting than anyone tells you it's going to be. I'm 54 years old. I have been doing this work since before most of the people in my former office were born. I know things about cost accounting and government contract compliance and the way precision manufacturers structure their vendor relationships that took me 3 decades to accumulate. That knowledge didn't go anywhere when they escorted me out of the building. It just didn't have a home for a while. It has a home now. The first time I sat in on a Vantage due diligence session, the lead analyst, a young woman who reminded me of my son's girlfriend, very sharp, very efficient, asked me how I'd approach reviewing a target company's intercompany accounts. I told her. I talked for about 8 minutes without notes, walking through the methodology I developed over 20 years of catching things that other people's systems missed. She typed while I talked. At the end, she looked up and said, "Where did you learn all that?" I said, 29 years of not looking away. She seemed to think about that for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to typing. I still keep a yellow legal pad next to my laptop. Same brand, same color. My wife bought me a new one when I started the Vantage contract, slipped it onto my desk without saying anything, the way she does things when she wants to mark a moment without making it a ceremony. I wrote the account numbers on it, the first project, the first target company, the first thing that didn't sit right. I wrote it down by hand, the way my old mentor taught me. On paper first. Always on paper first. Some things you keep, not because you're sentimental, because they work. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the sequence of it, but the logic underneath it. Why things unfolded the way they did. Why a $340 million acquisition collapsed not because of the economy or bad timing or some external force nobody could have predicted, but because of decisions made by people who believed that experience was an inconvenience and that loyalty was a cost to be eliminated. Here's what I've come to understand. The work you do honestly over a long period of time accumulates. Not in ways you can always see. Not in ways that show up on a performance review or get mentioned at a company dinner. It accumulates in systems, in documentation, in the quiet trail of decisions made correctly when nobody was watching. I spent 29 years writing things down on yellow legal pads. I spent 29 years flagging concerns through proper channels and keeping copies of the responses. I didn't do any of that because I was strategic. I did it because it was the right way to do the work, and when someone finally needed to understand what had really been happening inside that company, the record was there. I didn't have to build it in a hurry. I've been building it every day for 3 decades without knowing anyone would ever look. That's the thing about integrity that nobody talks about, because it doesn't make a very exciting story in the moment. It's boring. It's showing up at 6:47 in the morning and writing account numbers on a legal pad. It's sending an email to document a concern you raised verbally. It's asking a question about a $340,000 payment to a consulting firm you've never heard of. Even when the people above you clearly don't want the question asked. It doesn't feel like courage when you're doing it. It feels like your job. But it compounds. The same way any consistent behavior compounds over time. The same way my son's engineering coursework builds on itself. Each semester harder and more precise because of what came before. Honest work builds on itself. And dishonest work does too. That's the part they didn't account for. Every payment miscoded, every concern dismissed, every question deflected, those compounded as well, just in the other direction. By the time Vantage Industrial Partners started their due diligence, there was 29 years of my careful record keeping sitting alongside 18 months of something else entirely. The contrast was not subtle. My wife told me, the night I signed the Vantage contract, that she was proud of me. I told her I hadn't really done anything except keep good records and answer questions honestly. She said, "I know. That's what I'm proud of." I've thought about that a lot since then. We spend so much time. I spent so much time in those 8 months between getting walked out and getting called by Vantage, wondering whether doing things the right way actually matters. Whether the people who cut corners and move fast and replace the experienced person with someone cheaper and younger are simply going to win because they're willing to do things you're not. It's a real question. I don't want to pretend it has an easy answer because sometimes they do win. Sometimes the acquisition goes through and nobody looks too closely and the person who built the thing for 29 years just fades away. But sometimes the due diligence team is thorough. Sometimes the paper trail exists. Sometimes the work you did honestly is exactly what someone needs to understand the truth of a situation. And when that happens, it doesn't matter how old you are, or whether you have good posture, or whether you know how to call yourself a strategic operator. What matters is whether you did the work right when it was hard and unglamorous and no one was paying attention. I still get to my desk early. Old habit. My wife bought me a new legal pad when the contract started, and I put it next to my laptop the same way I always did. The work is different now. The company's different. But the way I do it hasn't changed, and I don't think it will. You don't abandon the thing that turned out to be the point.